I remember the day vividly, though I wish I could forget it. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning vegetation. The sky above painted in bruised shades of orange and gray as our war engines churned through the fragile forests of this primitive planet. We had come to conquer, to subdue, to claim what we believed was ours by right of strength. And why wouldn't we? For centuries, the hooved vanguard had swept across the galaxy, our hooves trampling resistance like brittle twigs beneath our weight. We were unstoppable, or so we thought. I am Commander Vren'thok of the Equan Dominion, a proud descendant of the great herd that once ruled entire star systems. My kind, tall, humanoid equines with sinewy muscles and sharp minds had long considered ourselves superior to the chaotic bipeds we encountered on our campaigns. Humans were no different at first glance, small, fragile-looking creatures with soft skin and dull teeth. They lacked claws, natural armor, or even the sheer physical power that most species use to survive. To us, they were prey, an annoyance at best and a resource at worst. We landed on Earth with confidence bordering on arrogance. Our fleet darkened their skies, 1,000 ships descending like a storm of iron and fire. Their cities fell quickly, their armies shattered before they could even mount a proper defense. It was almost disappointing how easily they crumbled. I remember standing on a ridge overlooking one of their ruined metropolises, my lieutenant braying in triumph beside me. "Pathetic creatures," he sneered, his mane glinting in the dying sunlight. "They'll make fine laborers once we've broken them." I nodded absently, my gaze fixed on the horizon. Something about this world unsettled me. Not fear, no, but an unease I couldn't quite place. The humans didn't fight like other species we'd conquered. They didn't retreat in orderly lines or surrender en masse when overwhelmed. They scattered like smoke in the wind, vanishing into forests and mountains only to strike back when we least expected it. Their tactics were chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous. Still, I dismissed my concerns as paranoia. After all, what could a handful of desperate primitives do against the might of the vanguard? We had orbital superiority, advanced weaponry, and numbers that dwarfed theirs by orders of magnitude. Victory was inevitable, or so I thought. The ambush came at dusk 3 cycles after our initial landing. My battalion, a force of nearly 5,000 strong, was advancing through a dense jungle region designated as Zone Theta 12. Intelligence had reported minor human activity in the area, scattered guerrilla cells armed with crude projectile weapons and improvised explosives. Hardly a threat to seasoned warriors like us. We marched in tight formation, our hooves pounding against the earth in unison as our armored exosuits shimmered under the canopy's dim light. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning for movement while our scouts fanned out ahead to ensure no surprises awaited us. Everything seemed routine, until it wasn't. The first explosion tore through our ranks without warning, a deafening roar that sent bodies flying like ragdolls. Before we could react, another blast erupted to our left flank, then another to our right. Chaos engulfed us as fire rained down from above and shadows flitted between the trees. "Hold your ground," I bellowed over the cacophony, drawing my plasma blade as panic threatened to overtake my troops. But it was no use. They were already breaking apart under the relentless assault. The humans emerged from their hiding places like phantoms, small groups clad in mismatched armor and wielding weapons that looked like relics from a bygone era. Yet they moved with precision and purpose, striking hard and fast before disappearing back into the foliage. Their attacks weren't random. They targeted weak points in our formation with surgical accuracy. Supply lines severed, communication relays destroyed, heavy artillery rendered useless. It was as if they knew us better than we knew ourselves. For every human we managed to kill, 10 more seemed to rise in their place, fueled not by desperation, but by something far more potent: defiance. They fought as if they had nothing left to lose, but everything still worth protecting. And then there was her. I didn't see her at first. Not until she stood atop one of our fallen war machines like some avenging spirit out of myth. She was small even by human standards, her dark hair tied back into a braid that whipped behind her like a banner in the wind. In one hand she held a rifle, in the other, a detonator that glowed ominously against her pale skin. Her voice cut through the din like a blade. "This is our world. You want it? Come take it. And then she pressed the button. The ground beneath us erupted as hidden charges detonated in unison, a chain reaction that sent shockwaves rippling through our ranks. Trees toppled like dominoes. Armored vehicles flipped end over end as flames consumed everything in their path. I barely managed to escape with my life that day, dragging myself from the wreckage with burns searing my flesh and pride shattered beyond repair. Of my once mighty battalion, fewer than 50 survived to tell the tale. We retreated after that, not just from Zone Theta 12 but from Earth itself. The cost of conquest had become too great, victory too elusive against an enemy who refused to break no matter how hard we tried. Now I sit here aboard what remains of our fleet, a defeated commander haunted by memories of those defiant eyes staring back at me through smoke and fire. Humans, they are not prey or pests or resources waiting to be claimed. They are something far more dangerous than we ever imagined. Survivors. The day of the battle still gnaws at me, a phantom ache in my mind. I can recount every detail, every misstep, every moment where the tide turned against us. I had thought myself a master of war, a tactician honed by centuries of Equan tradition, but the humans, they fought as if war itself was etched into their very bones. They were not soldiers in the way we understood the term. They were something far more primal. Barbarians, yes, but barbarians with a cunning that defied reason. We entered Zone Theta 12 at dawn. The jungle was alive with sound, a cacophony of alien birds and insects that grated against our ears. Our war machines carved paths through the dense undergrowth, their plasma cutters reducing ancient trees to ash in seconds. Drones buzzed overhead, their sensors sweeping for any sign of human movement. It was supposed to be routine, another sweep and clear operation to flush out the remnants of resistance. But even then, there were signs that something was wrong. The jungle was too quiet in places, the natural symphony of life falling into an eerie silence as we advanced. My scouts reported strange markings carved into trees, symbols and patterns that meant nothing to us but seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. We dismissed them as primitive warnings or attempts at psychological warfare. How foolish we were. The first attack came as we crossed a narrow ravine. Our column was stretched thin, with heavy artillery units bringing up the rear and infantry spread out along the ridge. Without warning, the ground beneath our lead vehicles gave way, collapsing into a pit lined with sharpened stakes and explosives rigged to detonate on impact. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves through our ranks, throwing soldiers and machines alike into disarray. Before we could regroup, they struck again. From the treetops came a hail of projectiles, bullets and arrows tipped with some kind of corrosive substance that ate through our armor like acid. The humans moved like shadows among the branches, their faces painted with mud and ash to blend into their surroundings. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like predators, stalking us, striking from angles we couldn't defend against. I remember shouting orders into my comms, my voice hoarse with frustration as reports flooded in from all sides. Ambushes along the flanks, supply convoys destroyed by improvised explosives buried in the soil, snipers picking off officers with unerring precision. It was chaos. Pure, unrelenting chaos. And yet, there was a method to their madness. Every attack was calculated to sow confusion and fear, to force us into positions where we were most vulnerable. They didn't engage us head-on. They didn't need to. They let the jungle itself do their work for them, using traps and terrain to turn our superior numbers and technology against us. I saw one of them up close during that initial skirmish, a young male barely out of adolescence by human standards. He emerged from the undergrowth like a specter, his body covered in makeshift armor cobbled together from scavenged materials, metal plates strapped to his chest with leather cords, a helmet fashioned from what looked like an old industrial machine part. In his hands he held a crude but deadly weapon, a long spear tipped with jagged metal that glinted menacingly in the dim light. He charged at one of my lieutenants without hesitation, letting out a guttural roar that sent shivers down my spine despite myself. The lieutenant raised his plasma rifle to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, the human hurled his spear with terrifying accuracy. It pierced straight through the lieutenant's chest plate, embedding itself deep enough to knock him off his feet. The human didn't stop there. He leapt onto the fallen soldier like a feral beast, pulling a blade from his belt and driving it into exposed joints between armor plates with brutal efficiency. By the time I managed to draw my own weapon and fire, it was too late. The human had already disappeared back into the foliage. Barbarians. That's what I thought in that moment as I stared at my lieutenant's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood and oil. These creatures were nothing more than savages wielding tools they barely understood. Or so I told myself to keep the fear at bay. But deep down I knew better. They weren't savages. They were survivors, hardened by millennia of struggle on this unforgiving world they called home. Where we relied on discipline and technology to win our battles, they relied on instinct and ingenuity. They adapted faster than we could anticipate. They learned from every encounter and used our own strengths against us. And worst of all, they enjoyed it. I saw it in their eyes whenever they emerged from cover to strike. A glint of wild exhilaration that spoke not just of defiance, but of something deeper, a primal joy in combat itself. To them, war wasn't just a means to an end. It was an art form, a dance of death performed with reckless abandon. We thought ourselves conquerors when we arrived on Earth, masters of strategy who would bring order to this chaotic world through sheer force of will. But on that day in Zone Theta 12, we learned what chaos truly looked like. And it wore human faces painted in blood and ash. The difference in numbers was staggering. My battalion alone numbered nearly 5,000, armored warriors clad in the finest exosuits our Dominion could forge, supported by towering war machines and aerial drones. We were a tide of steel and muscle, a force designed to sweep across worlds like a wildfire. And yet, the humans who opposed us, they couldn't have been more than a few dozen. A few dozen. It defied all logic. No species we had ever encountered would dare face such overwhelming odds. Most would surrender outright, their leaders groveling at our hooves in hopes of mercy. Even those who resisted did so with hesitation, retreating when the weight of our numbers bore down on them. But these humans? They didn't retreat. They didn't hesitate. They charged into battle with the reckless abandon of creatures who had long since made peace with their own mortality. I remember watching through my visor as one of their groups, a ragtag cluster of maybe 10 or 12 fighters, emerged from the jungle to confront an entire armored column head-on. It was madness. Our tanks were colossal machines, bristling with plasma cannons and reinforced with energy shields that could withstand orbital bombardments. Against such power, these humans had nothing but crude explosives and small arms that barely scratched our armor. And yet they came. They moved like ants swarming a predator, darting between trees and boulders as they closed the distance. One of them, a woman with a bandolier of grenades slung across her chest, leapt onto the lead tank as it fired, her body silhouetted against the blinding flash of plasma discharge. She clung to the hull like some kind of insect, ignoring the turret's frantic attempts to shake her off as she worked furiously to plant an explosive charge. I shouted for my gunners to take her down, but it was too late. The charge detonated with a deafening roar, ripping through the tank's shield generator and sending shrapnel flying in every direction. The woman was vaporized in the blast, but her sacrifice wasn't in vain. The tank's systems failed catastrophically, its engines erupting in a plume of fire that consumed everything within meters. And then, they did it again. Another human, a man this time, his face obscured by a crude mask fashioned from scrap metal, rushed forward with what looked like a bundle of wires and pipes strapped to his back. He ducked under a barrage of plasma fire, zigzagging wildly as he closed in on one of our heavy walkers. The machine's pilot tried to stomp him out like an insect, its massive foot crashing down mere inches from his position. But the human was too fast. He reached the walker's leg and triggered his device, a makeshift bomb that sent shockwaves through the jungle as it tore through hydraulics and servos with terrifying precision. The walker collapsed in a heap of twisted metal, its pilot screaming over comms before static overtook his voice. It wasn't just bravery that drove them. It was strategy, brutal and unrelenting. They didn't waste lives in futile gestures. Every attack had purpose, every sacrifice calculated to inflict maximum damage on us. They knew they couldn't win through sheer force, so they fought with cunning instead, targeting our weak points, exploiting our overconfidence. I watched in disbelief as they turned even our own machines against us. One group managed to hijack an abandoned tank left behind during an earlier skirmish, rigging it with explosives before driving it straight into our formation like some kind of suicidal battering ram. The resulting explosion obliterated 3 vehicles and sent dozens of my soldiers scrambling for cover. It was barbaric. It was insane. And it was working. For every human who fell, and many did, they took 10 of us with them. Their willingness to die for their cause was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. To them, death wasn't defeat. It was just another weapon in their arsenal. I remember one moment in particular that still haunts me. A young boy, barely more than a child by human standards, running toward one of our supply convoys with a satchel clutched tightly to his chest. He couldn't have been older than 14 cycles, his face streaked with dirt and sweat as he sprinted through gunfire without flinching. We didn't realize what he was carrying until it was too late. The satchel exploded as he reached the convoy's center, engulfing half our supplies in flames and sending shockwaves rippling through our ranks. The boy's body was gone before it even hit the ground, reduced to nothing more than ash and memory. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring at the smoldering wreckage as my soldiers scrambled to regroup around me. What kind of species would send their children into battle? What kind of madness drove them to such extremes? But then I understood. This wasn't madness. It was desperation born from something far deeper than fear or hatred. It was belief. They believed in something greater than themselves, something worth dying for even when victory seemed impossible. And that belief made them unstoppable in ways we couldn't comprehend. We had come to Earth expecting conquest, but what we found instead were warriors who fought not just with weapons but with hearts forged in fire. Barbarians? Perhaps. But if they were barbarians, then they were barbarians who had mastered the art of war better than any civilization we had ever encountered. It wasn't just their ferocity in battle that unnerved me. It was what came after. The way they treated the fallen, both their own and ours. I had seen countless wars, countless species rise and fall under the hooves of the vanguard, but never had I encountered anything like this. Humans, they had no respect for death. Or perhaps it was something worse. Perhaps they respected it too much, revered it in a way that made them dangerous beyond reason. I remember stumbling upon one of their makeshift camps after the initial ambush. My squad and I had been separated from the main force, retreating through the jungle as explosions and gunfire echoed in the distance. The camp was hidden well, nestled in a hollow beneath the roots of a massive tree, but the stench gave it away, a sickly mixture of blood, sweat, and decay. At first, I thought we had found a burial site. The bodies of their fallen were laid out in rows, their faces covered with scraps of cloth or leaves. But as I stepped closer, I realized this wasn't a place of mourning. It was something far more sinister. They were stripping their dead, removing armor, weapons, even clothing to repurpose for their own use. One human, a grizzled male with a jagged scar running down his cheek, was prying a helmet off a lifeless comrade's head with brutal efficiency, tossing it into a pile with other salvaged gear. Another was cutting strips of fabric from a blood-soaked uniform to use as bandages. There was no reverence in their actions, no ceremony or hesitation. To them, these bodies were just resources, tools to be repurposed for survival. But it wasn't just their own dead they scavenged. I saw one of our soldiers lying among the corpses, a young recruit whose name I'll never know. His exosuit had been torn open at the chest, exposing the charred flesh beneath. A human woman knelt beside him, her hands slick with blood as she worked to dismantle his armor piece by piece. She didn't flinch as she cut through sinew and bone to retrieve the power core embedded in his suit's spinal column. When she finished, she wiped her hands on her trousers and moved on to the next body without so much as a glance at his face. It was horrifying, and yet I couldn't look away. This was how they survived, by turning death itself into an asset. They didn't waste time grieving or honoring their fallen. They stripped them bare and used every part to fuel their war effort. It was efficient, yes, but it was also merciless in a way that chilled me to my core. And then there was how they treated us. I had always believed that surrender was an option, that even in defeat, there could be dignity if one laid down their arms and accepted subjugation. But humans, They didn't believe in mercy. Not for us. I saw it with my own eyes when one of my soldiers, a wounded scout who had been captured during the chaos, was dragged into their camp. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow as blood seeped from a gash in his side. The humans surrounded him like predators circling prey, their faces grim and unyielding as they argued in hushed tones. I couldn't understand their words. They spoke in harsh, guttural sounds that grated against my ears. But their intent was clear enough when one of them raised a blade high above his head. No! I remember shouting instinctively from my hiding place among the trees, though I knew they couldn't hear me. He's unarmed. He's... The blade came down before I could finish my thought. It wasn't quick or clean like an execution should be. It was savage, brutal, meant not just to kill but to send a message. My soldiers' screams echoed through the jungle as they hacked at him with crude weapons until there was nothing left but silence and gore. And then they laughed. Not all of them, just a few, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. To them, this wasn't just war. It was personal. Every death they inflicted on us seemed to carry an undercurrent of vengeance, as if each strike was repayment for some ancient debt we could never hope to understand. I wanted to hate them for it, to see them as nothing more than monsters masquerading as sentient beings. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was survival distilled to its rawest form. They fought like cornered animals because that's what they were, trapped on a dying world with no hope of escape except through sheer defiance. And yet, there was something else beneath their savagery, something darker that I couldn't quite name, but felt all the same. A hunger for victory so consuming that it left no room for compassion or restraint. They weren't just trying to win this war. They were trying to erase us from existence entirely. For the first time since landing on Earth, I felt fear. Not for my life, but for what we had unleashed by coming here. These humans weren't just warriors or survivors. They were something far more dangerous. They were relentless. The fear had rooted itself deep in my mind by then, growing stronger with every passing moment. It wasn't just the humans' savagery or their willingness to die for their cause. It was the realization that they were learning, adapting. Every skirmish, every ambush, every encounter, they were studying us, dissecting our tactics and technology like predators honing their craft. And we were bleeding. Slowly, inexorably, the hooved vanguard was being worn down by an enemy we had dismissed as primitive. By the time we regrouped after the ambush in Zone Theta 12, my battalion was a shadow of its former self. Our once proud war machines lay in smoldering ruins scattered across the jungle, their hulking frames now little more than monuments to our hubris. The soldiers who remained were battered and demoralized, their once gleaming armor caked with mud and blood. Even I, Commander Vren'thok, descendant of the great herd, felt the weight of despair pressing down on me like a yoke. We tried to consolidate our forces, to regroup and strike back with what strength we had left. But it was like trying to hold water in our hooves. The humans were everywhere and nowhere all at once. They didn't give us time to recover. They didn't allow us even a moment's respite. Every night brought fresh horrors. Traps that maimed our scouts, raids that decimated our supply lines, sniper fire that picked off officers one by one. And then there were the whispers. Rumors began to spread among my troops. Stories of human atrocities so grotesque that even the most hardened warriors shuddered at their telling. Some claimed they had seen humans dragging away our wounded, only to return their mutilated corpses days later, as a warning. Others spoke of entire squads disappearing without a trace, their last transmissions filled with screams and static. I dismissed these tales at first as fear-fueled exaggerations, but deep down I knew there was truth in them. I had seen what these humans were capable of, how they treated death not as an end, but as a weapon to be wielded against us. The final blow came on the eve of what was meant to be our counteroffensive, a last-ditch effort to reclaim control of Zone Theta 12 and push the humans back into hiding. We had gathered what remained of our forces in a clearing near the edge of the jungle, fortifying our position with what little equipment we still possessed. Drones patrolled overhead while sentries stood watch at every perimeter. And yet, they still found a way. It started with a low rumble that I felt more than heard, a vibration in the ground that sent ripples through my hooves. At first, I thought it was an earthquake or some natural phenomenon unique to this cursed planet. But then came the explosions. They hit us from below. Charges planted deep beneath our encampment that erupted like volcanic fury, tearing through soil and metal alike. Entire sections of our defenses collapsed in an instant, swallowing soldiers and machinery into fiery pits. Before we could even comprehend what was happening, they descended upon us. They came not as individuals, but as a swarm, a seething mass of bodies armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge or fashion from scrap. They didn't march in orderly lines or adhere to any discernible formation. They surged forward like a tidal wave, overwhelming everything in their path with sheer ferocity. I fought alongside my troops that night, not out of duty or honor, but out of sheer desperation. Plasma blade in hand, I carved through human after human, each strike fueled by equal parts rage and terror. And yet, it wasn't enough. For every one I killed, two more seemed to take their place, faces painted with mud and blood, eyes burning with unyielding defiance. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like demons unleashed from some ancient hell. I remember locking eyes with one of them, a woman whose face was obscured by a crude mask fashioned from shards of metal and bone. She carried no weapon save for a jagged piece of rebar clutched tightly in her hands, yet she charged at me without hesitation. I struck her down easily enough, one swift slash across her torso that sent her crumpling to the ground in a heap. But as she fell, she smiled, a twisted grin that sent chills racing down my spine. It wasn't until I saw the detonator clutched in her hand that I realized why. The explosion threw me backward into the dirt, my vision swimming as pain lanced through my body. When I finally managed to stagger to my feet, I saw what she had done. The blast had taken out one of our remaining artillery units along with half its crew. And still they kept coming. By dawn it was over. Our camp lay in ruins, smoke rising from craters where once stood proud banners bearing the sigil of the vanguard. Of my battalion's 5,000 warriors, fewer than 50 remained alive, and even they were broken beyond repair. The humans didn't stay to celebrate their victory. They vanished back into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared, leaving nothing behind but destruction and silence. I stood amidst the wreckage that morning, my armor scorched and battered, my blade slick with blood, and realized something I had refused to admit until then. We weren't fighting savages or primitives or barbarians. We were fighting monsters, creatures who would stop at nothing to defend their homeworld from invaders like us. And for all our strength, we had no answer for them. The silence after the battle was deafening. It was the kind of silence that settles over a graveyard, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on what little remained of my shattered battalion. Smoke hung in the air like a shroud, stinging my eyes as I staggered through the ruins of what had once been our encampment. The jungle, so alive and vibrant before, now seemed to mock us with its stillness. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if to bear witness to our humiliation. I looked around at the remnants of my forces, those few who had survived by sheer luck or cowardice. They were no longer warriors. Their eyes were hollow, their shoulders slumped, their once proud manes matted with blood and ash. They didn't look to me for orders anymore. They didn't even look at me at all. We were no longer an army. We were prey. And yet somehow I was still alive. I don't know why they spared me, or if they even noticed me at all in the chaos of their retreat. Perhaps I was simply beneath their notice, another broken piece of debris in a battlefield littered with it. Or perhaps they wanted me to live, to carry the story of what had happened here back to my people as a warning. If that was their intent, then they succeeded. I limped toward what remained of our command post, my hooves crunching over shattered equipment and scorched earth. The bodies of my soldiers, my comrades, lay scattered around me in grotesque poses, their lifeless eyes staring up at the sky as if searching for answers that would never come. And among them, among us were the humans. Their dead lay where they had fallen, just as broken and bloodied as ours. But there was something different about them, something that made my stomach churn even as I tried to look away. They didn't die like soldiers. They died like martyrs. I saw one human slumped against a tree, his chest riddled with plasma burns, but his hand still clutching a detonator that had likely claimed half a dozen of my troops. His face was frozen in an expression I couldn't quite place. Was it pain? Triumph? Both? Another lay sprawled atop one of our shattered tanks, her body mangled beyond recognition, but her fingers still wrapped around the hilt of a blade buried deep in an Equan soldier's throat. They died fighting, not for glory or conquest, but for something far more primal: survival. And then there were the messages, scrawled across the wreckage in crude letters, painted with mud, blood, or whatever else they could find, were words I couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. Symbols of defiance, warnings etched into the very bones of our defeat. One phrase repeated itself over and over again on walls and armor plates, and even carved into the bark of trees. This is our home. It wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration, a promise that no matter how many ships we sent or how many soldiers we deployed, we would never take this planet from them. I collapsed onto my knees amidst the rubble, my body trembling with exhaustion and despair. For the first time in my life, I felt truly helpless, not just as a commander, but as a being who had believed in the invincibility of his people. The hooved vanguard had conquered countless worlds across the galaxy, trampling resistance beneath our hooves without hesitation or remorse. But here on this cursed planet, we had met our match. No more than that. We had met something greater than us. Humans are not like other species we've encountered. They are not bound by rules or logic, or even self-preservation. They fight with a ferocity born from desperation and a cunning that borders on madness. They turn death into a weapon, chaos into strategy, weakness into strength. And worst of all, they never stop. Even now, as I sit aboard what remains of our fleet, a broken commander recounting his failures, I can feel their presence like a shadow looming over me. They are out there still, watching and waiting for us to return so they can finish what they started. But we won't return. The Equan Dominion has declared Earth off limits, a forbidden world too costly to conquer and too dangerous to ignore. Our leaders call it prudence. I call it fear. Fear of what these humans are capable of when pushed to the brink. Fear of what lies within them. The spark that turns prey into predator, victim into victor. I used to think we were superior, that our strength and discipline made us masters of this galaxy. But now I know the truth. We are nothing compared to them. Humans are not prey or pests or resources waiting to be claimed. They are survivors. And if you ever meet one, if you ever hear their war cries echoing through the void, remember this. They will fight you not because they want to win, but because they refuse to lose. And that is why we lost everything.